I want you to picture the worst phone call of your life. Now picture getting a second one 3 years later, telling you the first one was a lie. That's my story. My name's Sarah, and for 3 years I visited a grave that had no one in it. I brought flowers every single month. I cried on the anniversary of his death so hard I threw up in the grass beside his headstone. I let my daughter grow up believing her father drowned, saving a stranger's dog off the coast of North Carolina. That's the story I told her. That's the story he told me, through a note, through a life insurance payout, through a closed casket that the funeral home said was too damaged to view. 3 years. I wore black to his memorial. I spoke at it. I said the man was a hero. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday, in a grocery store 600 miles from our home, I looked up from a shelf of pasta sauce, and I watched my dead husband load a cart with his new wife's favorite brand of coffee. He was alive. He was tan. He was laughing. And when our eyes met across that aisle, I watched the color drain out of his face like he'd seen a ghost. Funny thing is, as far as the state of Ohio was concerned, he was the ghost. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I just smiled at him, real slow, and said 4 words that I'd been saving for 3 years without even knowing it. Hi, honey. Miss me? What happened over the next 4 months would destroy the life he built to replace me, and it would happen so legally, so quietly, and so completely that by the end, he wished I actually had just let him stay dead. Stick with me, because this story is about to get so much darker before it gets good. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're new here, I tell real revenge stories, the kind where someone gets betrayed in the worst way imaginable, and instead of falling apart, they get even. Smart, legal, devastating. This one might be the wildest thing I've ever narrated, because it's not just infidelity, it's not just lying. This is a man who faked his own death, insurance fraud, a funeral, a grieving widow, a fatherless child, just so he could disappear and start a brand new life with someone else. And I promise you, the plan that gets built in the second half of this video is one of the most satisfying things you will ever hear. There's a moment near the end where I actually get to watch him get handcuffed in his own driveway in front of the woman he left me for. But before we get there, subscribe now, because this story runs deep and it gets so much worse before we get to that part. Trust me, you do not want to miss the middle of this one. Okay, let's go back to the beginning, back before I knew who Mark Whitfield really was. I met Mark when I was 26, waiting tables at a diner outside Columbus, Ohio to pay off the last of my nursing school loans. He came in every Thursday morning, always ordered the same thing, black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and always left a 20 on an $11 bill. The first time he asked me out, I said no. The second time, I said no again, because I'd just gotten out of a relationship that left me gun-shy. The third time, he showed up with a single daisy from the gas station next door and said, "I'm not going anywhere. I've got time." Looking back now, that line hits different. But at 26, it felt romantic. It felt like patience. It felt like the kind of steady, grounded love I didn't think existed outside of movies. Mark worked in commercial insurance underwriting, assessing risk for a living, which is almost funny now considering everything. He was smart, funny in this dry way that snuck up on you, and he had this gift for making you feel like the only person in a crowded room. My mother adored him. My best friend Renee said, and I quote, "Sarah, if you don't marry this man, I will." We got married 18 months later at a small vineyard 40 minutes outside the city. 200 guests. His parents flew in from Arizona. Mine cried through the whole ceremony. It was by every measure the happiest day of my life up to that point. For the first few years, our marriage was genuinely good. We bought a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet subdivision. We had our daughter Emily when I was 29. Mark was a hands-on dad. Diaper changes at 3 a.m., Saturday morning pancakes shaped like animals, the whole thing. I used to tell people I'd won some kind of husband lottery. But if you go back now, knowing what I know, there were cracks. Small ones. The kind you explain away because you love someone and you want to believe the best version of them is the real one. The first crack was money. Mark started picking up side consulting work about 4 years into our marriage. Evening calls, a locked home office, a second phone he said was just for clients. When I asked questions, he'd get short with me, then apologize an hour later with flowers, and an explanation that always sounded reasonable in the moment. Insurance underwriting is a small, competitive world, he said. Clients don't like their consultants' wives asking about business. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? The second crack was travel. He started taking underwriting conferences that got longer and more frequent. 3 days, then 5, then once an entire 10-day trip to Charleston, South Carolina for something he called a risk assessment summit. I looked it up once. I couldn't find a single mention of it online. When I brought it up, he laughed it off, said it was an internal company thing, not open to the public, nothing to Google. The third crack, the one that should have told me everything, was a life insurance policy. About 5 years into our marriage, Mark came to me with paperwork and said he wanted to get serious about protecting the family. He took out a $2 million life insurance policy on himself. $2 million. I remember thinking it seemed like a lot for a man in his 30s in good health, but he explained it away with actuarial talk I didn't fully understand. Something about locking in low premiums while he was young, about wanting Emily's college paid for no matter what happened to him. I signed where he told me to sign. I didn't read every line. Why would I? I trusted him completely. Here's the thing nobody tells you about red flags. They don't feel like red flags in the moment. They feel like normal marriage friction. A little suspicion here, a little defensiveness there, and then a really good weekend that makes you forget the bad one. Mark was a master at that rhythm. Tension, then tenderness. Distance, then devotion. It kept me hooked in exactly the way he needed me to be. By year 6, Emily was 4 years old, and I genuinely thought we were building something solid. I had no idea I was living inside a man's exit plan. The trip that changed everything was supposed to be simple. Mark told me he was going on a solo fishing and kayaking trip off the coast of Wilmington, North Carolina, something he said he'd always wanted to do, clear of his head, get back to himself before his 40th birthday. I remember being a little annoyed he wanted to go alone instead of as a family trip, but I also thought everybody needs space sometimes. I packed his cooler myself. I kissed him goodbye in our driveway on a Friday morning in October. I never saw him alive again. Not for 3 years, anyway. 2 days later, on Sunday afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize with a North Carolina area code. It was a park ranger from the coastal district. He asked if I was Sarah Whitfield. He asked if my husband was Mark Whitfield, 40 years old, driving a gray Ford F-150 with an Ohio license plate. And then he told me my husband's kayak had been found capsized and empty 3 miles offshore in rough water, near a stretch of coastline known for a strong undertow. There was no body. There was a partially eaten sandwich still in a dry bag. There was his wallet, his phone, waterlogged but recoverable, and his wedding ring, sitting neatly on the driver's seat of his truck in the parking lot. They searched for 6 days. Coast Guard, local sheriff's department, volunteer boats. On day 7, they called off the search and classified it as a presumed drowning, pending recovery of remains. I remember sitting on my kitchen floor with Emily's stuffed rabbit in my lap, unable to process a single word coming out of my own mouth when I called my mother. I was a widow at 32 years old, or so I believed. But what happened next I never saw coming. The funeral happened 3 weeks later because it took that long for the coroner's office and the life insurance investigators to sign off on a death certificate without a recovered body. In North Carolina and in most states, you can get a death certificate issued through something called a presumption of death process when circumstances make survival extremely unlikely. A body swept out in a known dangerous undertow checked every box. We had a closed casket service. I want you to sit with that for a second. A closed casket for a body that was never actually found. I didn't question it at the time because grief doesn't leave room for suspicion. Grief fills every inch of you. I stood at that podium and gave a eulogy about a hero who loved his daughter more than life itself, and 200 people cried with me, including his own parents, who I now believe were just as deceived as I was. The life insurance company took 9 months to fully investigate and pay out, which at the time I thought was them being thorough about a tragic accident. $2 million. I used some of it to pay off our mortgage. I put a large chunk into a college fund for Emily. I kept working as a nurse because staying busy was the only thing keeping me upright. For 3 years, I built a life around a ghost. I took Emily to his grave on Father's Day. I let her write him letters that I'd fold up and bury in the dirt beside the headstone, like some kind of ritual that might reach him wherever he was. I dated exactly once, disastrously, and decided I wasn't ready. I told myself I'd loved my husband so much that I'd probably never fully move on, and I made peace with that. I was mourning a man who was, at that very moment, alive, tan, and rebuilding a new life 4 states away. Here's where I need you to understand something about how these schemes work, because once I learned the truth, I went back and reconstructed the entire timeline, and it is chilling. Mark had been planning this for at least 2 years before that kayaking trip. The side consulting work, that was him quietly liquidating assets, opening accounts in a name I'd never heard of, and, this is the part that still makes my stomach turn, building a relationship with another woman. Her name, I'd later learn, was Diane Castellano. They met at one of his underwriting conferences. Except it wasn't a conference at all. It was a work trip to a satellite office in Charleston, where Diane worked as a claims specialist for an insurance company, the kind of person who would know exactly how death investigations, missing persons cases, and insurance payouts actually worked from the inside. Do you understand what that means? My husband didn't just cheat on me. He found a woman with the exact professional knowledge needed to help him engineer his own disappearance and make it look accidental enough to survive an insurance investigation. I can't believe this. I genuinely could not believe this when I first pieced it together. My husband recruited a mistress with a claims adjuster's skill set specifically to help fake his death. They planned the accident together. Diane apparently helped him understand exactly which details investigators look for in a presumed drowning case. Currents strong enough to be plausible, a body of water known for never returning victims, timing that would create urgency without immediate suspicion, and evidence left behind. The wallet, the ring, the half-eaten sandwich, engineered to look like a man who simply went out for an ordinary afternoon and never came back. Mark didn't drown that day. He kayaked to a pre-arranged pickup point roughly a mile down the coastline, where Diane was waiting in a rental car. He left his truck, his wallet, and his ring behind on purpose. Within 6 hours, Mark Whitfield was legally missing, and a man using a different first name, I later learned he was going by Marcus Coleman, pieced together from an old middle name and a maternal grandmother's maiden name, was already 300 miles away. I want you to sit with the sheer coldness of that for a second. He didn't just leave me. He let me believe he died a hero. He let our 4-year-old daughter grow up thinking her father drowned trying to save someone. He let his own parents bury an empty casket and grieve a son who was, at that very moment, building a new house 4 states away with the money from our life insurance policy. I found out the full truth in pieces over the months that followed our grocery store encounter, through a private investigator I hired and, eventually, through a federal insurance fraud investigator who I'll introduce you to shortly. But I want to walk you through what I learned about the why, because it's almost more infuriating than the how. Mark wasn't running from danger. He wasn't in witness protection or fleeing a cartel like some movie plot. He was running from boredom, from the ordinary weight of being a husband and a father with a mortgage and a job he found unfulfilling. In a journal investigators later recovered, yes, he kept a journal because apparently even master manipulators get sloppy, he wrote about wanting a clean slate, about feeling trapped in a life he built too young, about Diane making him feel 25 again. He didn't hate me. That's the part that took me the longest to accept. He just decided that erasing me, faking his own death, and collecting $2 million along the way was an acceptable price to pay for a fresh start with someone new. I can't believe this. I said it before and I'll say it again, because there's no other honest reaction to learning the man who stood at an altar with you, who held your newborn daughter and cried, decided that the cleanest way out of a marriage he'd grown tired of was to let you bury him alive in your own mind for 3 years. Now, back to that grocery store, because I need you to understand what it felt like to stand there, alive, staring at a dead man buying oat milk. My body went cold first, then hot. My hand started shaking so bad I nearly dropped the pasta sauce jar I was holding. Every version of the last 3 years, every candlelit vigil, every daddy's watching over us from heaven conversation with Emily, every dollar of that insurance payout rearranged itself in my mind in about 4 seconds. He looked at me, and for 1 full second, I watched 40 different emotions cross his face. Shock, fear, and then, this is the part that made something in me go ice cold and calm all at once, I watched him calculate. I watched a man who had faked his own death and built an entire second life start doing math in real time about how to talk his way out of this, too. That's when I knew. Whatever grief I had left for Mark Whitfield died right there in the pasta aisle. Because grief is for someone you lost, and I hadn't lost him. He'd thrown me away, on purpose, with a plan, with a partner, and now he was standing there hoping I'd stay quiet. I didn't confront him in that store. I didn't cause a scene. I did something that scared him a lot more. I smiled. I said those 4 words, "Hi, honey, miss me?" turned my cart around and walked out. Because in that moment, standing in a grocery store in a town I'd never been to, staring at the dead father of my child, I made a decision that would define the next 4 months of my life. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to cry in front of him. I was going to become the most patient, methodical, terrifying version of myself he had ever met. And by the time I was done, he was going to wish the ocean had actually taken him. But what happened next, I never saw coming either, because it turned out my dead husband wasn't done running schemes. He was midway through building an entirely new one. Here's something I want every person watching this to understand. Revenge that actually works isn't loud. It doesn't happen in a parking lot with a keyed car or a screaming match on a lawn. The kind of revenge that truly destroys someone who wronged you is quiet, methodical, and built entirely on the truth. I got in my car that day, sat in the parking lot for a full 20 minutes, and did not cry. I made a list, an actual list, on the Notes app on my phone, titled Facts I Know. It had 4 items on it. 1. Mark is alive. 2. He's living under a different name in a different state. 3. He collected $2 million from an insurance company under false pretenses. 4. He abandoned our daughter and let her grieve a lie for 3 years. I want to be honest with you. My first instinct wasn't calculated at all. My first instinct was pure animal rage. I wanted to follow him home, bang on his door, expose him to whatever woman was standing next to him, and burn his new life to the ground with my bare hands. But I didn't, and here's why. Because rage gets you a headline for a day. A plan gets you justice for the rest of your life. I drove home that night, a 6-hour drive I don't remember taking, and the entire way I thought about one thing. Mark was an insurance underwriter. He understood risk, fraud, paper trails, and how investigations work better than almost anyone. If I came at him with emotion, he'd outmaneuver me. He'd disappear again, this time somewhere I'd never find him. I needed to come at him with something he couldn't outthink. The law. The first person I called wasn't a lawyer, it was Renee, my best friend since nursing school, the one who'd said she'd marry Mark herself if I didn't. I told her everything, sitting in my own car in my own driveway at 1 a.m., and she went so quiet on the phone I thought the call had dropped. Then she said one sentence I'll never forget. "Sarah, that man is going to prison, and I am going to help you make sure of it." Renee became my first ally, and honestly, my emotional anchor through everything that followed. But I needed more than emotional support. I needed people who understood fraud, insurance law, and how to build an airtight case. The second call I made, 3 days later, was to a private investigator named Gordon Reyes, referred to me by a lawyer friend of Renee's. Gordon had spent 15 years as a fraud investigator for a major insurance carrier before going private, and when I told him the story, a faked death, a $2 million payout, a new identity, he didn't even blink. He'd seen it before, just never one this well-constructed. "This is textbook life insurance fraud with a staged death," Gordon told me on our first call. "And here's the good news for you. This isn't just a moral betrayal. This is a federal crime. Insurance fraud over a certain dollar threshold, combined with identity fraud and a fraudulent death certificate, puts him in serious legal jeopardy. If we build this right, you don't just get closure, you get everything back, and he gets held accountable in a way you could never manage on your own." That sentence changed everything for me, because up until then, some small, exhausted part of me thought my only options were to confront him quietly and disappear back into my life, or to explode and ruin my own reputation trying to expose him publicly. Gordon showed me a third option, one that was slow, legal, and devastating. Over the next 3 weeks, Gordon and I built out what he called a confirmation file. We needed hard evidence before going to any authority because, and this still makes me furious to say out loud, technically, at that point, on paper, Mark was still legally dead. If I'd gone straight to the police with nothing but "I saw my dead husband in a grocery store," I'd have been treated like a grieving widow having a breakdown, not a woman reporting a felony. So we built the file properly. Gordon tracked the grocery store's business registration, and using the timestamp on my own phone and a receipt from that day, we identified the town, a coastal town in South Carolina, about 4 hours from where his kayak had capsized. From there, Gordon did what he does best: quiet, legal surveillance, public records searches, utility hookups, property records. Within 10 days, Gordon had found him. Mark, now legally going by Marcus Coleman, a name change he'd apparently filed for in a state with looser identification requirements, using a combination of forged and real documentation Diane had helped him access through her claims industry connections, was living in a modest but comfortable house registered under Diane Castellano's name. Property records showed the house had been purchased in cash 18 months earlier for just under $400,000. $400,000 in cash, less than 2 years after a $2 million insurance payout that I had used in good faith to pay off our family mortgage and fund our daughter's college account. Gordon confirmed Diane Castellano still worked, remotely, conveniently, as a senior claims specialist for a regional insurance carrier, a completely different company from the one that had paid out Mark's death claim. That detail mattered enormously, and I'll explain why in a moment. He also confirmed something that made my stomach turn all over again. Mark and Diane were married, legally, using his fraudulent Marcus Coleman identity. They had gotten married in a small courthouse ceremony 14 months after his staged death, which meant, horrifyingly, that on paper this man was simultaneously a deceased husband to me and a living husband to someone else using two entirely different identities that both, somehow, existed in government systems at the same time. I can't believe this. I said that phrase out loud alone in my kitchen when Gordon told me, because it meant Mark hadn't just faked his death to escape our marriage, he'd built an entirely parallel life, complete with a new wife using fraud so brazen it almost defied belief. Here's where the plan started coming together, and this is the part I know a lot of you have been waiting for. Gordon explained that insurance fraud of this scale, a staged death used to fraudulently collect a life insurance payout, falls under federal jurisdiction in most cases because it typically involves mail fraud, the claim documents, wire fraud, the payout transfer, and often identity fraud, the new name, the new marriage license, the new Social Security usage. That meant once we had enough documented, verifiable evidence that the moment law enforcement moved, there would be nowhere left for him to run. So for the next several weeks, our plan had 3 simultaneous tracks. Track 1, Gordon continued building the paper trail. Property records, the fraudulent name change documentation, banking activity that showed the insurance payout being funneled into accounts under the Marcus Coleman identity, and confirmation of Diane's employment and role. Track 2, I quietly consulted with a family law attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Ahn, about my legal standing. This mattered for 2 huge reasons. First, because I needed to understand what would happen to Emily's college fund and our paid-off mortgage, money that had come from a fraudulently obtained insurance payout, if this all came crashing down legally. Second, because I needed clarity on custody and child support, since, as far as any court was concerned, Emily's father was legally deceased, which meant reopening an entire can of legal worms the moment we proved he wasn't. Patricia gave me some of the best advice I've ever received. She said, "Sarah, you are the victim here, in every sense of the word, emotionally, financially, and legally. Let the authorities handle the criminal side. Your job right now is documentation and patience. Do not confront him again. Do not tip him off. Every day he doesn't know how much you know is a day closer to him having nowhere left to hide." Track 3, and this one was purely mine, was watching. Not stalking, not anything illegal, but simply paying quiet attention to his new life from a safe legal distance, mostly through Gordon's reports, gathering the emotional resolve I needed for what was coming. There was a near miss about 5 weeks in that still makes my hands shake thinking about it. Gordon had been photographing property exteriors and confirming vehicle registrations from public roads, completely legal surveillance, when Mark apparently spotted Gordon's car parked down the block 2 days in a row. According to Gordon, Mark came out onto his porch, stared down the street for a long moment, then went back inside and within 48 hours listed the house for sale. My heart dropped when Gordon called to tell me, if Mark was preparing to run again, we could lose him for good this time. No grocery store luck twice in one lifetime. But that's when Gordon made a suggestion that turned out to be the single smartest move in this entire plan. He said, "Sarah, he's spooked, but he's not gone yet. And here's the thing about men like this. They're arrogant. They think they're smarter than everyone around them. If we go quiet right now, completely dark, no surveillance, no contact, he'll convince himself he was being paranoid. Give him 2 weeks of nothing. Let him relax. And in the meantime, we finish building the case with the one piece of leverage he doesn't know we have." That piece of leverage was Diane's employer. Here's the beautiful, poetic detail of this whole plan. Diane worked as a senior claims specialist for an insurance company. A different company from the one that paid out Mark's fraudulent claim, yes, but part of the same national industry fraud reporting network that virtually all major insurance carriers participate in. This network exists specifically to flag patterns of fraud across companies, because fraudsters often use similar tactics across multiple claims. Gordon had a former colleague still working in that network's investigative unit. Once we had our documentation solid, the property records, the name change paperwork, the banking trail connecting the original payout to Mark's new identity, and photographic confirmation that Marcus Coleman and Mark Whitfield were the same living human being, Gordon's contact could file what's called a Special Investigative Unit referral. This wasn't us breaking any laws or violating anyone's privacy improperly. It was a legitimate, industry-standard fraud report, the exact same process that would happen if any claims adjuster suspected fraud in any case. The genius of this approach was that it triggered 2 separate investigations simultaneously, from 2 separate angles, neither of which Mark could see coming. The original insurance carrier that paid the fraudulent death claim would launch an internal fraud investigation the moment they were alerted that their deceased policyholder had been positively identified alive. And, separately, because insurance fraud above certain dollar thresholds, combined with identity fraud, typically triggers federal involvement, the referral would very likely land on the desk of federal investigators as well. 2 weeks of complete silence went by. Exactly as Gordon predicted, Mark took the house off the market, apparently convincing himself he'd overreacted. Life from the outside went back to looking normal for Marcus and Diane Coleman. That's when we submitted everything. Gordon's contact filed the Special Investigative Unit referral on a Monday morning in March. Patricia Ahn, my attorney, simultaneously filed paperwork on my behalf with the state to formally challenge and reverse Mark's death certificate, providing documented proof, including a private investigator's photographs and public records, that Mark Whitfield was alive and using a fraudulent identity. This was crucial, because reversing that death certificate was the legal key that would unlock everything else. It would restore my legal standing as a still married woman, invalidate the insurance payout as fraudulently obtained, and, most satisfyingly, formally establish on paper forever that Mark Whitfield had faked his own death. Within 6 days, a federal insurance fraud investigator named Agent Priya Malhotra contacted me directly. I remember sitting at my kitchen table on speakerphone, listening to a federal agent tell me, "Mrs. Whitfield, based on the documentation provided, we have sufficient probable cause to open a formal investigation into insurance fraud, wire fraud, and identity fraud related to the death and subsequent reappearance of your husband. I need to ask you some questions, and I also need to make you aware this is likely going to move quickly now." I asked her what quickly meant. She said, days, not weeks. For the first time in 3 years, I felt something other than grief, confusion, or rage. I felt the cold, steady click of a plan finally locking into place. Mark had spent 2 years meticulously engineering his disappearance. It had taken me a little over 2 months to engineer his reappearance, permanently, publicly, and completely on the record. But what happened next, the day it all actually came crashing down on him, I never saw coming, because I never expected to be standing there to watch it happen in person. Agent Malhotra called me 11 days later on a Thursday afternoon and asked if I wanted to be present at a safe distance with law enforcement when they executed the arrest. She said victims aren't always given that option, but given the highly personal, deeply cruel nature of what Mark had done to me and to Emily, and given that I'd be needed nearby anyway for the formal re-identification of the reversal of the death certificate, they could arrange it. I said yes before she even finished the sentence. Renee flew out with me. We checked into a motel about 15 minutes from the coastal South Carolina neighborhood where Marcus, and Diane had been living their $400,000 cash purchase life. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking about Emily, asleep back home with my mother, still believing her father was a hero who drowned saving a stranger's dog. I thought about every letter she'd written him and buried in the dirt beside an empty casket. I thought about every Father's Day I'd watched her cry into a picture frame. By the time the sun came up, I wasn't nervous anymore. I was ready. Agent Malhotra's team, a mix of FBI personnel and state fraud investigators, coordinated the arrest at 8 a.m., a time chosen specifically because both Mark and Diane would likely be home before either of them left for the day. I sat in an unmarked car about a block away with Renee and a junior agent named Ruiz, watching through the windshield as two SUVs pulled into the driveway of a pale blue house with white shutters and a wraparound porch, the kind of picture-perfect home Mark had built for himself using money that was supposed to be Emily's college fund. I watched agents approach the front door. I watched it open, and I watched my husband, tan, comfortable, wearing a bathrobe on a Thursday morning in his stolen life, step outside and immediately understand exactly what was happening. Agent Ruiz, sitting beside me, had the radio on low so I could hear. I heard an agent identify himself. I heard him say the words Mark Whitfield out loud, his real name, spoken for the first time in that neighborhood in over 3 years, and I watched my husband's shoulders drop like every ounce of air had left his body at once. Diane came to the door seconds later, and even from a block away I could see her face change from confusion to horror as she realized this wasn't a mistake, this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was federal agents standing on her porch with paperwork that would unravel every single thing she thought she'd built. They didn't handcuff him immediately. There was a conversation first. Probably them confirming identity, explaining the charges, giving him the chance to cooperate, but after about 4 minutes I watched an agent turn him around, gently but firmly, and I watched the unmistakable motion of handcuffs going on. I got out of the car. I know I wasn't technically supposed to approach yet, but Agent Malhotra had told me I could get close enough to be seen once he was secured, if I wanted to. I wanted to, more than I have ever wanted anything. I walked up that driveway in the cool morning air, past the flower beds Diane had clearly spent money maintaining, past a mailbox that said Coleman in cheerful vinyl lettering, and I stood close enough that Mark had no choice but to look at me. He said my name like it hurt him to say it. Sarah. I said, "Hi, honey. Miss me?" The exact same 4 words from the grocery store, except this time they didn't sound like a threat, they sounded like a verdict. I want you to feel this moment with me, because this is the one I know you've been waiting for. I said, "You let our daughter believe her father was a hero who drowned saving somebody's life. You let me bury an empty casket. You let 200 people cry at a funeral for a man who was hiding 400 miles away with a mistress and a stolen name, and you did it all for a check." He didn't say anything. What could he say? Diane was sobbing on the porch behind him, and I watched with a satisfaction I am not even a little ashamed of, as an agent walked toward her too, because, and this is the part that made every single person I've told this story to since actually cheer out loud, Diane wasn't arrested as a bystander, she was arrested as a co-conspirator. Here's the twist I promised you, the one I truly never saw coming until Agent Malhotra explained it to me weeks later during the case preparation. Diane hadn't just helped Mark disappear out of misguided love. Investigators found, buried in her work email, the personal account, not even her company one, because apparently criminals really do get sloppy, messages from over a year before Mark's staged death, discussing the plan in coded language and referencing at least one other person, a previous boyfriend of Diane's, who had gone through a suspiciously similar disappearance 2 states away 5 years earlier. Diane Castellano wasn't just Mark's accomplice. She had done this before. She'd apparently used her insider knowledge of claims investigations to help at least one other man fake his own death for an insurance payout years before she ever met Mark. Federal investigators believe she may have run this exact scheme, or a very close variation of it, at least twice. Yes, I know some of you just screamed that at your screen, and honestly, I did too, sitting in Agent Malhotra's office hearing it for the first time. The woman my husband left me for wasn't a tragic love story. She was a repeat offender who had turned faking men's deaths into something disturbingly close to a business model. The consequences unfolded quickly after that. Mark was charged with mail fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft at the federal level, along with state charges for insurance fraud and falsifying a death certificate. Because the total fraudulent payout exceeded $2 million and involved a multi-year premeditated conspiracy, federal sentencing guidelines put him in serious jeopardy. His attorney reportedly advised him a plea deal was his best chance to avoid the maximum exposure, which, combined across all charges, could have meant well over a decade in federal prison. Mark ultimately took a plea deal. He pled guilty to federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft and received 7 years in federal prison, along with a court order to repay the full $2 million fraudulent payout, which, practically speaking, meant the $400,000 house was seized and sold along with several other assets as part of restitution. Diane's case ended up being even more serious once investigators connected her to the earlier scheme in the other state. She's currently facing charges in 2 separate jurisdictions, and given the pattern of repeated fraud, prosecutors are pursuing the maximum sentence available. And me? Because the death certificate reversal process was completed alongside the criminal investigation, my marriage to Mark was formally, legally acknowledged to have never ended in death. It ended in fraud. Patricia helped me file for divorce on the grounds of that fraud, which streamlined everything enormously, and because Mark's ill-gotten assets were being seized for restitution anyway, I wasn't required to return the mortgage payoff or Emily's college fund, since that money was legally mine as the innocent victim of his fraud, separate from what he'd hidden away in his new life. The most unexpected twist of all, though, came about 6 weeks after the arrest. Mark's own parents, the same parents who'd flown in for our wedding, who'd sobbed at his fake funeral believing they'd lost their only son, reached out to me. They apologized, genuinely and repeatedly, for something that was never their fault, and they asked if they could still be part of Emily's life as her grandparents, regardless of what her father had done. I said yes, because Emily didn't do anything wrong either, and she deserved to keep the parts of her family that were actually built on love, not lies. The hardest part of this entire ordeal wasn't the legal process, and it wasn't even standing in that driveway watching him get arrested. It was sitting Emily down at 7 years old and telling her that her father wasn't a hero who drowned saving a stranger's dog. He was alive. He had chosen, deliberately, to disappear from her life, and now he was going to prison for it. I won't pretend that conversation was easy, or that she processed it the way an adult would. But I told her the truth in a way a 7-year-old could hold on to, that some people make choices that hurt the people who love them most, and that it was never, ever her fault, and that she was loved completely and fiercely by everyone who was left standing. Looking back now, almost a year removed from that morning in the driveway, here's what I've learned. Betrayal doesn't always look like a text message from someone else's phone or lipstick on a collar. Sometimes it looks like a closed casket. Sometimes it looks like 3 years of grief for a man who was very much alive, laughing in a grocery store 4 states away. But I've also learned that the quietest kind of justice is often the most complete. I didn't need to scream at him in that driveway. I didn't need to ruin my own life chasing revenge that would land me in legal trouble of my own. I gathered the truth, patiently, methodically, and I let the exact systems he thought he'd outsmarted, insurance fraud investigation, federal law enforcement, a death certificate he thought was permanent, be the thing that finally caught up to him. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. If your gut is telling you something is deeply wrong, even after years of grief, even after you've built your whole understanding of your life around a story someone told you, trust that instinct enough to look closer. The truth doesn't disappear just because someone worked hard to bury it. Emily is 8 now. She's smart, she's resilient, and she's loved by people who never lied to her a single day of her life. That's the family I've built in the wreckage of the one he tried to burn down. I'd love to know if you were standing in that grocery store aisle, staring at a husband you'd buried 3 years earlier, what would you have done in that moment? Would you have confronted him right there? Would you have walked away and called the police immediately? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story kept you here till the end, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because I've got stories just like this one coming every week. Real betrayals, real consequences, and the kind of justice that actually feels earned. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.